Hello, this is James Batchelor, and you're about to listen to a selection from my first audiobook, The Night's Dawning, available for sale now. In future videos on this channel, I hope to bring you more of my books, as well as talk about what inspired them, challenges and criticisms that I've faced, as well as a variety of other topics related to writing and publishing in general. So get subscribed so you don't miss out. One final note. In this presentation, I've included the first 10 chapters from The Night's Dawning, but I've spread them across multiple videos in order to keep them in manageable sizes. I will put them all in a single playlist for ease of listening, so look for that on my channel. And now, please enjoy The Night's Dawning. Pendant Publishing presents The Night's Dawning, the first book in the Crusades series, by James Batchelor, read for you by the author. Dedication. For Jared, for everything he wanted to be, for everything he could have been, and for everything he was not. Prologue. Persia, Mount Element. The blindfold was at last removed, and Amir blinked away the tears that the light brought to his eyes. Though it was not bright, after so many hours in darkness, it was searing. The first objects he could make out as his vision slowly adjusted were sconces holding a few flickering torches that did little to hold back the darkness that surrounded him. In front of Amir stood a large ornate brazier. Inside the brazier boiled a vile-smelling liquid he could not identify. His guide was before him, robed and hooded as before, and staring at Amir from the blackness of his hood. As Amir's vision at last came into focus, a chill ran up his spine. He and his guide were standing in a dark cave, and they were not alone. 12 robed figures surrounded them with their backs to the wall, all watching Amir silently. Amir had sensed that they were not alone, but the presence of these ominous figures in the cramped cave was oppressive, and he felt a strong impulse to run. He was not thinking clearly. He knew that. He was exhausted, thirsty, and ravenously hungry from the grueling series of initiation rites he had just undergone. He knew all these things contributed to his present state of mind. Nevertheless, that did not change the fact that he was afraid. Being unusually large since boyhood, Amir only remembered being afraid of one man in his life. Now, however, in his weakened condition, and knowing well the penalty for failing his initiation, he feared these men. The hooded figure before him reached out from the folds of his robe and handed Amir a book. "Throw this to the ground," he said. Amir inspected the cover and hesitated. He knew the book very well indeed, and knew that what the robed man demanded would be punishable by stoning among the locals. He himself had never particularly subscribed to these traditions, but there was no denying the influence these customs had on his life and people. It was no small thing to cast those aside. Nevertheless, Amir did as he was told. The heavy book hit the ground, sending a puff of dirt up into the smoky cave. "Spit on it," the robed man ordered. Amir hesitated a moment longer before following this order. "Is it possible that this is part of the test of the initiation, and by obeying I am failing?" he wondered briefly. The robed man pointed a bony finger at the book in the dirt. "This book is a dead law," he said. "The only law is the word of Imam Hassan ibn Sabah. If you have not accepted that, then you do not belong among us." Amir did as he was instructed and spit on the book with what little spittle he could muster from his parched mouth. "Grind it beneath your heel," the masked man ordered. Amir placed one massive boot on the cover and twisted his heel, breaking the spine and spilling the pages onto the dirt. "Who is the law?" "Imam Hassan ibn Sabah," Amir said. "Who is the law?" "Imam Hassan ibn Sabah," Amir said louder. "Who is the law?" "Imam Hassan ibn Sabah," Amir yelled. "Whom do you obey?" "Imam Hassan ibn Sabah," Amir shouted again. "How will you find your way back to paradise?" "Through the word of Imam Hassan ibn Sabah." The robed man produced a worn wooden cup from within the folds of his robe and filled it with the liquid bubbling in the pot. Into the cup he dropped a handful of dark powder that emitted a sinister hiss. He then extended the dark brew to Amir. "Now you will experience the pleasure of paradise through the word of Imam Hassan ibn Sabah. Drink." Amir looked at the cup skeptically. The pleasure of paradise. Did that mean he had been found unworthy? Was this how candidates who failed the initiation were dispatched? "Drink!" the robed man snarled, again thrusting the cup toward Amir. Amir reluctantly accepted it. He understood that his life was in the hands of these mysterious men regardless of whether he drank or not. He poured the burning liquid into his mouth and cringed as it seared his tongue and throat. He tried to swallow it quickly to prevent it from doing any more damage, but the bitter, acrid taste caused him to gag it back up. He fought against his reflexes, and after several attempts managed to get it all down. It took only a few moments for Amir to feel the effects of the drink. He became light-headed and euphoric. The cave swirled around him, and he fell back on the cool dirt. He did not know what was happening to him, but it suddenly did not matter any longer. He was happy. The cares that brought him to seek out the Nizari, the worries over his raped country and the European devils who seemed to come in an endless torrent, were of no concern now. He was vaguely aware of the men who had been standing in the shadows closing in and lifting his limp frame from the ground. He felt the cool night air replace the stuffy air of the cave as he floated up to a softer, gentler place. Amir slipped in and out of dream until he could no longer tell which was which. He could not remember being carried up the steep mountain trail that led to the fortress of Alamut. What he could remember was lying in a lush garden, surrounded by beautiful women playing soft music and feeding him. Several of the most alluring provided him more sensual gratifications. The foreign devils would be dealt with in time, but for now, Amir was nestled in Allah's bosom. Chapter 1. Eastern Roman Empire, Adrianople. They were in there. He knew they were. From his camp, Richard could only make out the silhouette of Adrianople. The sun was setting behind it, obscuring in shadow all activity on the battlements of the fortified city. But he knew Emperor Kaloyan and the Bulgarian army were behind the walls, preparing to try and destroy Richard and his men. Richard's hands unconsciously balled into fists, causing the cord-like muscles in his chest and neck to tighten and bulge under his armor. He wanted more than anything to descend on the city and crush the Emperor, but he could not attack them in their stronghold. He would have to wait on them.
"Sir Richard," Count Louis called from behind him. "Sir Richard, I would speak with you."
There was a definite challenge in the Count's reedy voice, and Richard could hear several sets of feet. The Count was not alone.
Naturally, Richard thought, he would never have the courage to confront me alone. "What is it, Louis?" Richard snapped without turning. He routinely dispensed with honorific titles for men he considered beneath him, and Count Louis was definitely such a man. Richard detested these Frenchmen, their Norman sense of superiority and their pompous language that he was forced to speak in proper Norman fashion.
An Englishman by birth, Richard wore his father's Norman heritage like a badge when it suited him, but his Saxon blood, descended from his mother's side, detested these petty little aristocrats that assumed ascendancy over others by right of their birth, rather than through the strength of their sword arm. It galled Richard that he had to fight alongside these tarts who were more interested in showing off their shiny armor than in earning glory through combat. But Richard had neither land nor knights of his own on whom to call, so he was forced to make do with these men of the Pope's army. Count Louis moved up beside Richard, accompanied by a reluctant-looking Geoffrey de Villehardouin and Manasses de Lisle. He was holding a letter in his hand, the contents of which Richard could easily guess at.
"Sir Richard, I brought my knights up from Constantinople to offer succor to what I believe to be a crusade led by a man sanctioned from the Pope. Now, at this critical juncture, I discovered this."
He waved the letter in the air. "You would not even be in Constantinople if not for me," Richard muttered indifferently.
"What is left of it? Your charter was to take the city from Alexios V, not burn it to the ground."
Richard turned slowly to face the Count. In his blood-red armor, marred with 1,000 battle scars and standing nearly 7 feet tall, Richard towered over Count Louis in his new suit of armor that had yet to see combat.
"There were a handful of us who penetrated the walls of a hostile city. With nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, we had to find some means of fortifying our position until reinforcements arrived. The fire we set kept the enemy at bay. What would you have done?" Count Louis unconsciously leaned away from Richard. "Yes, well," he said in a decidedly less accusing tone, "perhaps it was prudent at that." Richard grunted and turned back to his inspection of Adrianople. "Be that as it may," Louis's voice gained some resolve, "it does not change the fact that you also led the siege of Zadar in Croatia. Deny it if you will." Louis puffed out his chest as though he had just scored a winning blow. "Was the city taken in the siege?" Richard asked nonchalantly. "It was." "Then it was me who led it." "That is exactly the point. Zadar was a Catholic city, and His Holiness expressly forbade your attacking it." "His Holiness should have thought of that before commissioning the Viennese to assist in this crusade with silver marks he did not have." "You dare to impugn His Holiness? He is infallible." "That is good to know," Richard snapped sarcastically. "His infallibility was a tremendous comfort to me when I arrived in Venice with 12,000 men and 50,000 silver marks to pay for their passage, and a city of Venetians expecting 85,000 marks. They had suspended their commercial operations for a year in order to build the fleet to accommodate his army, and were not about to accept less than was promised. Had I not agreed to invade Zadar for them, this crusade would have been over before it began." "Heresy! You are no better than the heathens." "You want to know about heathens?" Richard whirled on him. "My spies report that Emperor Kaloyan has sided with the Cumans." "What?" Louis scoffed. "Do you understand now? It is not just the Bulgarian army we face. It is also the Wallachians, the Greeks, and the heathen Cumans." "Impossible! The Cumans have been the rivals of the Bulgarians for—" "It is most curious how a common faith between people only bonds them so long as it is convenient." "I was right about you. It is no wonder you are being excommunicated." He waved the letter in his hand again. "It is my duty to remove you from your position as commander of this army, Sir Richard." Richard snorted. "Does that letter list me by name?" "It states that His Holiness has excommunicated anyone that had anything to do with the attack on Zadar, which, by your own admission, you not only participated in, but led." "It is a political move, you fool. Innocent wanted me to do what I did. It was the only way that his armies could be standing here now about to rid the church of this pesky division, but he cannot be seen to condone an attack on his own people." Louis was trembling with rage. "I will not listen to your heresy and your lies any longer. We all know what this is really about, and it was never the Pope. This is about your own aggrandizement. You only intend to use his army to prove to your family that you are worthy of the name Dawning." Richard's head snapped around and his eyes were suddenly hard as steel. Louis recognized that he had just scored a hit and smirked. "That is correct, is it not, Sir Richard? We all know the story. This is all to prove to your family that you are not a disgrace, that you are a worthy heir of your Norman father rather than a lowly Saxon like your mother. Yet you have no army of your own, so you simply appropriated someone else's. You care nothing for the Christian cause or these crusades." Louis smiled smugly. "It seems you need us more than we need you after all. We hold the power now, and I am assuming command." Richard's gauntleted fist lashed out like a serpent and struck Louis in the face, catapulting him off his feet and landing him several yards from where he had been standing. In shock, Geoffrey and Manassas looked between Richard and Louis. As one, they sprang to the Count's side to help him to his feet. Richard stepped over to the barely sensible Count, who stood on unsteady legs. Geoffrey and Manassas both nervously retreated a step from their ferocious leader, who was still in his passion. Richard seized the top of Louis's breastplate and lifted the smaller man until he was at Richard's eye level. Rage pulled taut every muscle of Richard's square jaw and neck. "You dare to presume you know me," he whispered, "and then come here and attempt to usurp my authority by means of some silly formality?" Richard shook the Count like a rag doll. The two other knights exchanged glances, feeling that they should intervene, but each feared the wrath of Richard's terrible rage. "I am Richard Dawning!" Richard shouted into Louis's face. "The greatest member of the greatest family of warriors ever born! It is your honor to ride with me. It is your privilege to die in this cause, in the hope that one day your name will be memorialized beneath my feet while I sit on the throne at Windsor Castle. You must decide here and now, will you ride with me or die where you stand? Make your choice." Count Louis choked out something that sounded like acquiescence, and Richard let him fall to the ground. "Now you two," he addressed the other knights, "given that we are outnumbered by the enemy, what is the plan?"
"Oh, well," Geoffrey spoke hesitantly, "we thought it best not to attack them in their stronghold. We were going to wait them out, let them come to us. Lord Manassas and I are each guarding an opposite gate with our men only—"
"Only what?" Richard snapped, again turning to face the city.
"There is some concern," said Manassas, "that we may have to wait a very long time."
"It will not be long," Richard assured them.
"They outnumber us, and Kaloyan is struggling to maintain an uneasy alliance between his people, the Greeks and the Cumans, all of whom are natural enemies. Even a fool like Kaloyan knows that will not hold. No, we will not have to wait long. Tomorrow, perhaps."
"Oh, no, they will not attack tomorrow."
"Why so certain?"
"Tomorrow is Easter, a high day. Emperor Kaloyan is still a Christian. He would not attack on such a holy day."
Richard grunted. He wondered if these two had even been listening to the conversation about ideology that he and Count Louis had just had. "Very well," he said dismissively. "It shall be as you say. When Kaloyan attacks, I will lead the army out to meet him. You two will remain behind with your detachments to secure the camp." The men nodded, helped Count Louis to his feet again, and withdrew.
The priest turned his back to the men who were assembled in the oversized tent, which had been erected to serve as a church to the Crusaders. He bent before the altar, crossed himself, and began to recite.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
"Where is Richard?"
Count Louis whispered to Manassas as the server continued the recitation. Though the tent was bulging at the seams for the mandatory Easter Mass, Richard's huge person was notably absent.
"He seemed unconvinced that Kaloyan would not attempt an attack on a high day. I suspect that he is standing watch."
"That fool!"
Louis spat in disgust. His face was swollen and purple from his encounter with Richard the previous evening.
"He's as much a barbarian as the Cumans ever were."
Manassas grunted noncommittally and turned his attention back to the dais. The priest, in his elaborately embroidered robe and hat, began a recitation of a psalm.
Judica me Deus, et discerne causam meam de gente non sancta, ab homine iniquo et deloso eruem me.
There was a stir outside the tent that few noticed over the chanting, but Manassas heard it and cocked his head to listen.
Quia tu est Deus fortituda mea.
"What is that?" he asked aloud.
What is what?
I do not hear anything.
Emite lucem tuam e veritatem tuam.
Just then a guard burst through the flap of the tent that served as a door. "Attack!" he cried. "We are under attack!" "Impossible!" Count Louis exclaimed. "What is he playing at?" Louis looked questioningly at Manassas, but his friend was already on his feet and among the press of knights racing for the exit. Louis reluctantly followed.
Minutes later, Count Louis and his knights began streaming from the camp in various stages of dress, some without portions of their armor, others buckling on weapons. For his part, Louis skipped his leggings and wore only his cuirass. He found Richard mounted in full armor astride his huge black war horse, barred in blood-red plates to match its rider. Richard donned his iron helmet, also red, but with a gruesome bone mask. The helmet was dreadful to behold and added to Richard's fearsome presence, which had already earned him a reputation as a spawn of the underworld, sent to harvest the souls of the damned. Count Louis timidly took his place beside Richard. He was glad Richard's helmet was already in place, so he could not see the look of disgust that was surely directed toward him from the black eye sockets of the bone mask.
"Why here?"
Louis asked, more to take the focus off of him and his blundering knights than out of any real curiosity.
"Why are they attacking from the north instead of from the city on the west?"
He fixed his gaze on the dust cloud of enemy riders that was resolving into individual enemy soldiers as they rapidly descended on the camp, and he had his answer. "Cumans," he breathed. The Cumans were famous for their swift, light cavalry and the short bows that they fired with deadly accuracy from the saddle at full gallop. Their horses were fast, their warriors fierce, and they were not likely to adhere to the standards of war to which the chivalry were accustomed.
"We will ride them into the ground," Richard muttered darkly.
The knights were still in disarray behind him when he held his lance aloft, the church's banner fluttering from the end of it just below his own crest, a diagonal banner of blue surrounded by 3 blue birds' wings. The chivalry followed his lead and raised their own weapons.
"We will stand strong for everything we have fought for, and for everything we believe in. Here, on this battlefield, today, we will reunite the church, and glory shall be ours." A great cheer rose from the Crusaders. The Cuman riders were nearly on top of them now, and they could wait no longer. "For glory!" Richard roared and spurred his horse forward.